Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to a 3 News Digital exclusive. I am Ben Axelrod. Joining me today is Jim Donovan and Nick Camino. A lot going on in the sports world and a lot going on with the Cleveland Indians back on the field for spring training 2.0 here, back at Progressive Field over the weekend and having some workouts there today. But the big news with the Indians came from over the weekend when the team released a statement saying that they are looking into state of their franchise as far as what their name is, and signaling pretty clearly that they're looking into changing their name. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But real quick, I just want to read this statement we got today from the Cleveland Indigenous Coalition on the Indians team name. And the statement, it's a lengthy statement, but part of it comes from Josh Hunt, the vice chair of the Committee of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance. And he said, Native Americans, like all people, want our children to believe in themselves and have the confidence to follow their dreams. A growing body of scientific research clearly demonstrates Native American team names and logos reflect and reinforce harmful racial stereotypes about Native Americans. These images and team names have been found to contribute to low self-esteem, low community worth, increased stress and depression in Native people, especially in Native youth. In Cleveland, we see the findings reflected in the experiences of our community members. So all that's to say, it looks like we're gearing up for the Cleveland Indians to not only potentially, but I'd say at this point likely change their name. Jim, you've been following this team a long time. As you saw that statement on Friday night, what was your reaction?
Well, I go back really, Ben, and I can reflect back on following them, whether they played at the old stadium down at Municipal Stadium and then the beautiful ballpark at Jacobs Field and then the renaming to Progressive Field. And what always struck me was that when you went down on the day of their home opener, there would be a small circle of very peaceful protesters, Native Americans, who were there, who were protesting the name and most certainly the logo of Chief Wahoo. And thousands of people, because the Indians always had big crowds, even at the old stadium for opening day, thousands of people would walk by them, and some might make a joke towards them. Some might listen, although I don't think a lot of people listened. I think they were intent on going in. It used to strike me to say, gosh, they really are committed to this because year after year after year, they are here on the day of the home opener, but nothing is going to get done. Now, all of a sudden that started to take form. And I think the other day when Terry Francona came out and said, I think it's time that we take a look at this. Things have changed. Society has changed, and it really has. Then it really hit me that I think we are on the road to having that happen, that they will be maybe soon, maybe in a year or so, they will no longer be the Cleveland Indians. They'll be the Cleveland something other than Indians.
Yeah, and that's, you mentioned Chief Wahoo, and the team removed him as their official logo before the 2019 season. And that was such a big fight and a long struggle. And, it's really been kind of fascinating to see now the name that seemingly happened overnight. I mean, that there wasn't really even as far as a big public fight over the course of the last couple of weeks. It was more aimed toward the Washington Redskins. But once the Redskins put out that statement on Friday morning, I mean, it was just a matter of hours before the Indians put out their own statement essentially saying the same thing. Nick, what about you? You've been close to this franchise. Are you surprised this all kind of happened as quickly as it did?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I was a little bit surprised that by Friday night it seemed like that had come out of left field. I know there's been talks about it, but it just kind of seemed like that there was a lot of focus on what was going on with the Washington Redskins, and the Indians thing kind of came out of it. I know exactly what Jim's talking about. Year after year, we would see the protesters, and we've certainly heard it from people, but I just thought the timing of it on Friday night, I think it kind of took everybody by surprise. Even if you think the name should change, I think everybody was kind of like, well, okay, they're going with this. And I remember at the time, 2018, that loss to the Houston Astros. That was the last time they wore Chief Wahoo. And I remember people saying, what should they do now going forward for a logo? And I remember just saying to myself, well, if you're just going to have that block C and you're not really going to have a logo now with Chief Wahoo gone, maybe it's time to just change the name altogether. And I remember when I mentioned that on the radio, just kind of joking around, a lot of people were like, oh, you can't change the name. You can't. And I thought to myself, well, if we're getting away from a logo that's perceived to be racist, then why would we keep the name really? And then, time went on and I kind of, I guess it just went away. No one really talked about it. But I do think it's time for change. I think Jim hit it on the head. I mean, society has definitely changed where we're, going into a period of, you can probably just do something that everybody can get behind that is not offensive to people. So I am in that camp of change the name, time to move on. I will say this though, because there were a couple different polls that people threw at me that I had to double check on this. A poll in 2016, and this is where that statement that you read at the beginning, Ben, is interesting because a lot of what you hear nationally from Native Americans is a different story. I mean, in 2016, a poll from the Washington Post, 9 in 10 Native Americans were not offended by the names or logos. In 2019, there was a survey of Native Americans, Washington Post. The word most used to describe Native American names and logos was proud. And again, this is just one poll. This is just another survey, but it was from the Washington Post, and I thought that was interesting. So I sometimes do wonder, is the aftermath or the backlash, whatever the noise that's coming out of this, is it coming from Native American people? When I read polls like that and surveys like that, I do question that. But I am in the camp of time to change the name. But I did find those interesting. I wanted to share those today.
Ben, it really seems as though this really got rolling right after that World Series with the Cubs. And it seemed at that point in time, that was the time then where all of a sudden that all-star game was being dangled out in front of Cleveland. And it seemed as though we had a commissioner now in Rob Manfred that really wanted to press the issue much more so than maybe other commissioners in the past. It just seemed as though he was intent on it. I don't know if that was thrown out there as far as, hey, listen, you got to start thinking about getting rid of that logo, going to that Block C. I know that they were gradually going into that, but we would be much more amenable to bringing that all-star game to Cleveland if these things started to go away. It just seems to me that that's when the ball started rolling. Now, what's happened here, in the last couple of months, I think things in the past have bubbled up, even with the Redskins, and they have always been able to fend it off and block it off, even when their logo and their trademark was being, battled for out in the public. But I think now it's a different thing. This thing has mushroomed now. And I think that's why you're going, it's the perfect time for change. I think there's going to be a lot of change in a lot of ways we do things, never mind just how we name our teams. But I go back to that year right after that 7th game in that marvelous World Series against the Cubs. That's when the logo was going to go. That's when we were going to get that all-star game. And now I think things have really mushroomed.
Yeah, and that's something, you mentioned Rob Manfred and the All-Star game. And that was something, it seemed like an almost not so subtle trade-off. It almost seemed as if, hey, if we're going to bring the All-Star game here, I mean, I think it was only a matter of a couple of weeks before
Chief Wahoo is not invited.
Very much so. But I mean, that's something, it's one thing to change a logo. The Indians as a team name has been this team's identity since 1915. The franchise has obviously been very attached to it. Even getting rid of Chief Wahoo, officially they were still selling Chief Wahoo gear in the team shop as recently as last season. So I guess that's one reason why I was in one way surprised, I guess, because I know how, one, there's a lot of Indians fans sensitive to changing the name, and then two, the Indians themselves, they've shown some sensitivity as far as, hey, we don't want to change this name. But last week when everything was going on with the Washington Redskins and they received all that pressure from their sponsors, once that happened, I think it was only a matter of time. I mean, that's what once the Washington Redskins, who had their put their foot down on this issue more sternly than the Indians have, once they said that they're looking into changing their name, I think it was only a matter of time before the attention shifted toward the Indians. So I think in some ways the Indians did get out ahead of this, even if in other ways they're kind of late to this party.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Was it FedEx was, I know, one of the big sponsors, which is where they play, right? FedEx Field,
right,
which is where they play. And the other thing I'll say on this too, Ben and Jim, is I do think when things happen at first, initially, there's always going to be people on one side that oppose it, and then there's people that are supporting it. I do think time heals stuff, and as it goes on, if when this is done or if it's done, and it seems like it will be, I think eventually people are going to let it go. It's your favorite baseball team in town. You're going to be rooting for them, and I don't think a name, at least for grown men like us, I don't think that a name is going to really hold too much over for you to be upset about this for too much longer. So initially you're going to have this, and maybe that's why the Indians put this out there, that the discussions are beginning. But once it happens, I think that eventually people will let it go. I know there were people that were saying, well, it'll be Jacobs Field forever to me. Well, now a lot of people call it Progressive Field. There are a lot of people saying, well, I'll always wear Chief Wahoo. Well, I feel like we're seeing more Block C's now. So I think eventually people will let this go.
I mean, people in Brooklyn even root for the Dodgers sometimes now.
I mean, that's true. I mean, uniforms change, and usually there's a big backlash when a team, you go to the Cleveland Browns, and maybe that's not the best example here because those uniforms were hideous. But had that team won more, I think people would have, taken to those uniforms. I think winning cures all in sports. And hey, if the Cleveland Gladiators or the Cleveland Spiders come out here and win a World Series, I don't think there's going to be a lot of people saying, but man, it's not the Indians.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, winning would really cure a lot of things. I do believe, though, of all the sports, baseball is very sentimental about its history. So if and when it does happen, I think there will be a great deal of sadness connected to it. I think that a lot of people may say, okay, I understand. And maybe there will be a fraction or a ratio of people that will never say that. But I do believe people are very, very, in baseball, sentimental about history, sentimental about Roger Maris's home run record, about DiMaggio's hitting streak, sentimental, like I said, about the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn and going out to LA, and the Giants leaving New York and going out to San Francisco. Baseball people really seem to hold it very, very close to the heart. So I think, unlike when they closed the stadium and Bob Hope saying thanks for the memories as they closed it down that day, I think there will be some tears shed when this becomes reality.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I grew up on the 90s Indians. I mean, that was the team that got me into sports. Yeah. All I've known is the Cleveland Indians for my whole life. It's hard to – I mean, that's kind of one thing. I could always wrap my mind, and I always knew they were going to remove Chief Wahoo at some point. I mean, that seemed inevitable. But the name change, for whatever reason, like till Friday night, really, I couldn't bring myself to that point to even really consider that was a real possibility. I know there, one, it seemed like a lot of the backlash toward the Indians was aimed towards Chief Wahoo. And then two, it seems so far-fetched. But yeah, I mean, that you look at the way the momentum really picked up on it, it was only a matter of time. I was driving around listening to some sports talk radio over the weekend. You both are veterans of sports talk radio. I will say, out of all this, sports talk radio is reinvigorated. Lots of callers with lots of opinions that we haven't really seen over the course of the last couple of months. So I'm going to pose it to you guys, and Nick, we'll start with you. What name has caught your eye as far as what the Indians could potentially be transforming into?
Yeah, this is like, Jim can probably attest to this too. This is the most hot button topic, I think, on sports talk radio since LeBron left or something like that. I mean, it's just everybody seems to.
Well, that's fitting because the anniversary to that is Wednesday, I think.
That's right. So, I mean, that's. I know a lot of people have an opinion on this one. Here's my worry on this of the names that have been brought up, guys. They mentioned spiders, which I know that even has a little history to it. I personally hate spiders, so it's because I don't like the animal. The spiders, they creep me out. The Rockers is interesting, but I know that we had a WNBA team that was the Rockers. So one cool thing that's been brought up is the Guardians, which is on that bridge, I think, in downtown Cleveland. But I don't know. I haven't given it too much thought, but it scares me that the ones that have been brought up, I'm not too crazy about yet.
Ben, if Lindor would sign, I would be all for calling them the Lindors.
Yeah. Hey, that's the Naps. The Naps have been mentioned, and that was obviously a nod to a former player. I think that's a time in sports we could go back to where you're naming these teams after players.
You know what would be interesting, and I don't know that this has happened. Maybe you guys have been a little bit more plugged into this than obviously I have. So I know what Francona and Lindor had comments about it today, and all the Indians today in a massive media session out at their spring training 2.0. They were all asked the question. I think they were all politically saying the right thing. But it would be interesting, wouldn't it, if Bob Feller was still alive? Okay, what would be his opinion on this? Because number one, Bob would definitely have an opinion on this. What about some of the past Indians? What do they feel about this? I mean, what do they feel about renaming the team? That would be interesting to me, and fill me in if they have said something.
I haven't seen anything. I don't know if you've seen anything, Nick. I do think that's actually a very interesting aspect of all this, though, just from a historical perspective. It's
right.
One thing to remove a logo, and you can put the Block C on Jim Thome's Hall of Fame plaque. What if Omar Vizquel gets into the Hall of Fame here in the next couple of years? How do you look back on the 90s Indians and the 40s Indians and the more historical teams? I don't think that's something you can kind of just erase like a logo. I mean, I think it's almost one of those things that they're going to have to acknowledge and kind of just, say, yeah, this is a part of our history and we've moved on since.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And I do think you can have both. You can still have the history of the name. It's not like you have to completely erase that it was ever here. I mean, they were called the Indians since 1915, but you can also change the name and kind of move on here. I mean, we've seen teams change their name before. This isn't completely crazy. So I think Terry Francona said it over the weekend. He said, when we had Chief Wahoo and when we've used the name Indians, we've never used it to be disrespectful. But now we are learning that things do change. So in that way, to answer your question, Ben, I don't think referring to the Indians' history is going to ever be looked down upon. It is what it is, and now they've changed the name.
Jim, what about you? You mentioned the decision. If you had to make a decision here, as far as what the name would be, what has kind of struck your fancy?
Gosh, I really, I have not really wrapped I'm thinking of every animal, Ben, that might have a good sound to it and a good ring to go along with Cleveland. My friend Tony Grossi said to me today, "What about the Blue Sox? We have the Red Sox, we have the White Sox. What if we had the Blue Sox?" But I don't know if I don't know where you draw the Indians' history into that. I mean, they've worn a lot of different kinds of socks. I mean, I can't come up with one so far. I know I probably should have, but I haven't.
Yeah, no, scanning social media, that's the one thing is, people have ideas here and there, but there's no really uniting, this is what all the fans are behind. Some like Spiders, some Guardians is gaining traction. And I'd have to say, of the ones I've heard, Guardians, I do like. I think there's some cool merchandise opportunities there as far as the logo and some of the gear. I think the location with the stadium and the bridge, that makes a lot of sense. So that's the one I probably I've kind of looked at more than others. But one, I don't know how feasible it is. And then two, I don't love it, but I do like it more than some of the other alternatives out there.
No matter what, we're going to hear from the people that hate the decision, no matter what they go with. We know that.
Oh yeah, I think that's about as much of a guarantee as you can get here. Okay, let's get to some baseball real quick, and then we'll get out of here. Indians back on the field for spring training 2.0, and everything. All indications from Progressive Field is everything's going well. Delino DeShields did contract the coronavirus, and he's kind of in a waiting pattern right now. So that's been the one negative there. There were other players who had tested positive before reporting, but other than that, it looks like Delino's the only one currently out. No players talking about sitting out the season. However, around baseball, it looks like there are some issues. Some teams not getting their tests back, which has led to them not practicing on Monday here after the holiday weekend. And that's the big thing in all this is testing. These players need to be tested. That's the one thing. Baseball, they were bound to have some hiccups, but so far that looks like the biggest hiccup they're having right now is if they can't get this testing thing figured out, it's really going to be hard to get this show on the road here in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think so. I think everybody, Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, and certainly college football. They're all sitting there. And I think, especially the NFL and probably college football, they're going to go to school on Major League Baseball right now and see how they do it, what worked, and as you said, if the testing is a problem, what didn't work, because it's basically an outdoor sport. They're going to travel, unlike the NBA and NHL, who are going to be based in these hub cities, in this bubble down in Florida. But I think everybody, all of these professional leagues and college football too, is saying, if we could just get some form of a season, a full postseason, a champion, and get to next year. I think that's what everybody wants to have happen. And hopefully the health situation of the world, never mind our country, but of the world will be in a better way, where even if we don't have a vaccine, we do have a treatment regimen that would work. But I really believe that that's what everybody is trying to do. And I think Major League Baseball, all eyes are on them right now to be able to pull this off.
Nick, we haven't talked, at least on one of these shows, about the way baseball has gone about this. What do you think of the way they did the scheduling with the 60 games, and then it's going to be 40 games against your own division and 20 games against the National League counterparts of that division? And then two, just like Jim said, no bubble. I mean, the NBA, it seems like from a safety standpoint, the NBA is on top of this, and that might not even stop, coronavirus from penetrating the bubble, and we see positive tests popping up across the NBA. What do you think of this baseball setup, Nick?
Yeah, I think the NBA approach seemed to make more sense. I kind of thought if they could have brought everyone to Arizona and make a bubble there for baseball, or to Florida, which now it so happens those are two of the hardest hit places with what's going on with the coronavirus. But I think that bubble approach might make the most sense. So this is an interesting decision by Major League Baseball. You mentioned the 60 games. There was just that ugly back and forth between the players union and the owners, and they've never seemed to get along. So that's what kind of created this 60-game season. But I do think if they're able to take all the protocols and do everything they're supposed to do, and they're able to pull this off, just get the season in and get to next year, as Jim said. Yeah. I do think this 60-game approach is going to be fun. I don't know if I want to say NFL-esque, but if you lose 3 in a row or 4 in a row, it might feel like you've lost 10 in a row. And if you win 3 in a row or 4 in a row, it might feel like you've won them. I mean, I just think everything is going to be so much more accelerated, where you can't get off to a slow start. And if there's one knock on Terry Francona baseball teams over the last couple of years, it's been that they've gotten off to a slow start. So you better not get off to a slow start. You can't afford it. And I think the Indians are going to be in a 3-team race for sure now, with the Twins and the White Sox in it.
Yeah, and your note about Terry Francona, certainly I've seen that out there too, and that's certainly something to think about. I'm going to flip that on its ear, though. I think if there's one manager cut out for a unique 60-game season, you could argue it's Terry Francona, with how innovative he's been with the bullpen, with some of the other things he's done in past regular seasons, and shifting his lineups, whether it be in Boston or in Cleveland. I think Terry Francona is uniquely qualified for such a strange potential season we could be having here.
Well, the other thing about him is, and it's just the kind of guy he is, but he has such compassion for his players, and I think that's going to be absolutely necessary in every clubhouse across Major League Baseball. Because here's what I worry about. I mean, I worry about these tests, and are there enough tests, and is there going to be, are they going to get hit with a lot of positive tests on teams? But then stretch that out a little bit. I worry about the wives of players, the children of players, who would be innocent victims of being brought into a situation where suddenly their health becomes a real problem. And if I can read something into the lines of Terry Francona, especially over the last week or 10 days since the team and since he has arrived back in Cleveland, I sense that he's really worried about that. And I just think that, number one, I think his players always play hard for him anyway. But I think in this situation, because he has real human compassion for people around him, I think that's very, very vital. I really do. I think he's the perfect guy for this situation, because these are absolutely extenuating circumstances.
Yeah.
And guys, I think you guys will agree too on that. When it comes to these teams, that's what separates. I've had a lot of people have emailed me or even tweeted at me saying, well, golf is pulling it off. Well, okay, but golf is an individual sport. If a guy ends up contracting this, unfortunately, he'll go away for a period of time. And once he tests negative for it, he can come back on tour. But his team isn't relying on him. It's him and his caddy out there and whatever. Sports is so different where, if the entire Cleveland Indians team was to get knocked out with this, or the Kansas City Chiefs or whoever, I really wonder about that variable of golf is individual. This is a team sport we're talking about. That to me is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, and that's to Jim's point. I mean, this is the first team sport trying to take a crack at this. I think one of the discerning things about this is there's been a lot of pessimism lately around baseball. I mean, you've had reporters saying there's no way they finish the season. You've seen Chris Bryant come out today saying, quite frankly, I don't really feel safe about this. Mike Trout's been pretty outspoken. I think to Jim's point, I mean, all eyes are on baseball right now, and baseball is still early in this thing, but here we are on July 6th, and just a couple of weeks away from this season supposed to be getting it back out on the field, and it still feels like there's some skepticism that that's even going to be happening.
Yeah, I think until they get out there and can get some kind of pattern to it, and I do believe there'll be adjustments that have to be made. Until they get into some kind of a rhythm with this, and we're just talking about, hey, should they have bunted in the 8th inning, rather than what's going on inside that clubhouse, or we learned that 3 guys went out after the game and didn't social distance, and now they're testing positive. Those are the kind of things that they have to get away from. And if they can, that's what I think they're really trying to do. If we could just get into baseball, albeit in a sprint rather than a marathon with 60 games, that would be mission accomplished, I think, for them.
Well, I'll tell you what, I would love to debate 8th inning bunts with you guys, hopefully here in the very near future. But that is going to have to do it for us today. We are out of time. For Jim Donovan and Nick Camino, I'm Ben Axelrod. Thanks for watching our 3 News Digital